Hello, everyone. Do you remember the Satanic Panic? Well, that's the topic of discussion today. No top 10 lists, no album rankings, no album reviews. We're going to talk about music, and we're going to talk about a topic dealing with music. But it's going to be slightly different than what we normally do. I'm starting a new series on my channel, and it's basically going to deal with topics dealing with music and entertainment as we progress and the channel grows, hopefully. And so I wanted to start these series with something that really had a major impact on me personally while I was growing up, and that was an era that we now refer to as the Satanic Panic. This was largely between the late 70s and early 90s, and really peaked in the mid to late 80s. And what the Satanic Panic was, basically was a hysterical movement that was basically promoted and engineered by moral crusaders, televangelists mostly, some politicians, and it really grew into a mass hysterical movement that really went beyond entertainment. It went beyond music. And a lot of people's lives were ruined because of it. And we'll get into that topic at some other time. But right now, let's just keep it simple, all right? Let's just get down to what the topic at hand is today. The Satanic Panic was mostly, as I said, in the 80s, and it dealt with a lot of music that a lot of these moral crusader types deemed satanic, or influenced by demons in order to corrupt the youth. Now, we know that there have been movements that were blamed for corrupting the youth in the past, all the way back to Socrates. But this was a specific time that I personally was involved in. Now, when I say involved, I mean involved as a kid. I was anywhere from 9 years old to about 17 years old during that era. So I grew up practically in that sort of time period, and at the same time the Cold War as well. So we feared the Russians and we feared the devil at the same time. A lot of fear going on. But there were certain books and certain videos that were released during this time that were intended for an audience of teenagers mostly, or children, or parents to watch TV evangelists talk about certain rock musicians and their alliance with Satanism, allegiance to the devil, things of that nature. And to be honest and fair, even though it was a hysterical movement with a lot of silliness going on, there were a lot of interesting things that happened in music at that time that I think promoted that. I mean, there were a lot. I mean, today's music is a little different. Back in the 80s, there were a lot of heavy metal bands that were very popular. Even when the glam pop metal came in, there was still a lot of albums and a lot of bands that did indeed speak of Satan or hell or the devil or evil. They would put imagery, occult imagery on their albums. I hate this camera. They would put, occult, satanic imagery on their albums. I mean, so they didn't do a lot to, for the case against them basically they were helping these TV evangelists promote the fact that they were agents of the devil. So I'm sure some of those bands did it intentionally. Some of them did it as, as a gimmick or whatever, and some of them probably were serious. But to totally say that, the evangelists of the time were just flipping out and making up stuff, and which a lot of them were. There was a hysterical movement. So, but these rock and roll guys, they were milking it. They were promoting it. They weren't doing anything to go against the grain, so to speak, that they weren't agents of the devil. And some of them were, generally interested in the occult. So, there was concern there, and understandable concern, but that concern just turned into a paranoid movement. A lot of stuff just went insane. People's lives were damaged during that time. It was really not a good time. But it was a good time in some ways. I'm kind of nostalgic sometimes to watch those old videos and read those old books. Just to, I don't know, it's nostalgic. It's almost comic relief sometimes. But, like I said, those bands, they did, say something. Highway to Hell. Come on, guys. Ozzy Osbourne, Mr. Crowley, and Black Sabbath, and they did a lot to push that. And so, of course, those guys, the evangelists and the moral crusaders, were going to jump on that wagon and ride it. But they may have done it in a way to where it increased the popularity of some of these bands. I know that some of the videos that I watched as a child during that time introduced me to bands I'd never heard of. And so, these ministers were talking about how terrible these bands were. But, as a child, I'm curious, and afraid at the same time. Because a lot of this music was quite eerie, especially if you're a child. I remember, and I'm about to get started, but I remember watching one video of this guy. He was in like this darkened church setting and had like this backdrop screen, and you could hear thunder rumbling from time to time. And I don't know if it was real or if it was just part of the presentation. And he would play a lot of these music clips and some videos, and then he would preach a little bit and talk about how terrible the band was. And then he played clips of like The Exorcist and tied it in with the occult. It was just, but I remember I would watch that video over and over and over as a kid. And it was a mixture of terror and total curiosity, to know more. Because, face it, when you tell someone you can't do this and that's forbidden, that's the first thing they want to do, usually. Well, it was me. Maybe I'm different. But today, I want to get on the topic finally. I just wanted to do that as an introductory, so when I do the next episode, we'll kind of, be caught up, know what we're talking about. But this is a list of songs that terrified me, or maybe just gave me the creeps, maybe scared me a little bit as a kid. And a lot of these were on this video, but I wanted to share them with you today. Let me pull up my list here, because I made a little list. And some of these songs, it's not necessarily the entire song, but it could be parts inside the song that really creeped me out. I'm going to start with one that really terrified me, and it was the introduction to a song that's really not scary once the song gets started. But I remember watching this video of this minister speaking of the evils of rock and roll and this band, and he played a clip of this song by Electric Light Orchestra, and the song in question is called, it's off the Face the Music album. And if you've ever seen the album cover, it's weird enough. But the song is called Fire on High, and it's the first track on the album. And it has a lot of orchestration in it, backwards masking. It has a lot of it has some choral effect on it where it's a very distant and strange hallelujah chorus they're singing. There's some backwards speech on it. The backwards music is eerie enough, and backwards speech is eerie enough. So all that combined with the choir and just these very horrific sounds that you would hear like in a horror film, and all that put together, it was just extremely terrifying as a kid. I remember I would want to cut that off every time it got to that part. And when the song kicks in, the song's fine. It's not really eerie at all, but it was just that introduction part. Now, the interesting thing was backmasking was huge during the Satanic Panic era, where they would take a record and play it backwards, and it supposedly had a backwards message. Well, usually that was just not true. Usually what had happened was the way you would sing a certain thing, when it's played backwards, it sounds like something else. Like, for example, and you can use, if you have a video recorder on your phone or computer, you can say it and then reverse it, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's not like an intentional message, but there is a way to create intentional messages. And so this is exactly what ELO did at the beginning of this album. And the song is eerie enough when it's played, and it's got that backward sound to it. But when you do reverse it, and I took my finger and pushed the record back, there's a voice that comes over the song, and it's clear as clear can be. And it says, the music is reversible, but time is not. And then it says, turn back, turn back, turn back. And he just keeps going, and it's just this madness. And I remember doing that as a child, and it just scared me to death. I mean, I was like, yeah, man, the devil's in this record, But it was fascinating at the same time. It was scary and fascinating. And I think, a lot of that panic did drive a lot of fascination as well. I'm sure there was more than one child that watched one of these videos that was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to keep watching this just for the craziness of it. Another song that terrified me was not the song. I enjoyed the song as a child, and it was called Another One Bites the Dust by Queen. I love that song. Had a groovy beat, dun 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 dun, another one bites the dust. I mean, just very cool song. But there was a middle section in this song where it breaks down, and these noises, and it has some backwards sounds too, just that sort of sound, and it was just this. Again, it was almost like they used these horror sounds in the middle of the song. And I'm like, man, this song's not supposed to be scary, it's supposed to be grooving. And then suddenly it breaks down into this horror type sound. And I remember as a kid, every time I would get to that part, I would just close my ears, and I would just be like, oh, please let it be over. And now, I'll listen to that, and I have those thoughts. I go back to that time, and I'm like, why did they put that in that song? It was terrifying. But, yeah, that was another one that really gave me the creeps as a kid. I remember standing in my cousin's bedroom, and I was as a little kid anyway, and he had like all these posters of Kiss, and his room was dark, and just, I don't know, it was already a creepy atmosphere. And so then he would play that kind of music. Another song that gave me the creeps, again, not the entire song, but just a section of the song, was Dazed and Confused by Led Zeppelin. However, I will say that Dazed and Confused is kind of an eerie song. I mean, the entire song is eerie, but there's a section in it that I later learned that it was Jimmy Page doing bow work. Working with the violin bow on the guitar, and it gives this weird sound to it, strange sound. And so there's a section in Dazed and Confused that breaks down, and it's just very, scary to a child. And so there were just songs like that, Fire on High, another one, Bites the Dust, Dazed and Confused, that weren't necessarily frightening in and of themselves, but they had these little parts in them. So, the song would play, and then these parts would come in, and, I would just be terrified. Now, Pink Floyd did this a lot. You can hear some pretty scary stuff on the album Ummagumma. And there's one song in particular that my son used to listen to off the Metal album called Echoes, which is one of my favorite Pink Floyd songs. But there's a section in Echoes where it breaks down into this very horror movie section of music, and it's almost like these bird calls or screams or wail, whatever you want to call them. But I mean, it's very weird section of that song. And like, if you're ever driving at night, and I was driving on one of the older roads in my county one night, and I was listening to that song as an adult, and my son was a little kid, he was a baby, and he was in the back seat asleep, and I remember that coming on, and I was just like, man, that is weird. I'm out in the middle of nowhere, but it was funny. You look back on it because your mind just goes in so many different directions when you're in sort of that mindset. The next song I want to talk about is not necessarily a section of a song, and it's not really a rock and roll song, but it was a song that my mother had a record, little 45 record she used to play, and it was by a kind of a country comedian musician by the name of Jim Stafford, and the song was called Swamp Witch. And I remember listening to this song as a young child. I was probably 4 or 5 years old, and that record would come on, or I would tell mother to play that record, and my uncle would tell me this story of a witch that would live down the road from me, and I'd always think that song on that record was about the woman that lived down the road, and it was just frightening, but at the same time I wanted to hear that record, and just his voice and the music, and it's just the entire song, and he's telling this creepy, almost Southern American Gothic sound, Blackwater Hattie the Witch, and it was just such a wonderful song. And I go back sometimes and listen to that song, but it was very scary and exciting, as a kid. A couple of other songs that terrified me for different reasons. Black Sabbath had a few songs that were kind of eerie to me. Super Czar, I'd heard that one from my cousin, I think. The title track, Black Sabbath, I really didn't hear that until later on, so I was kind of out of it. But yeah, they always kind of terrified me. AC/DC, I remember that was a big band back then. I really got into AC/DC later on, but I was afraid of AC/DC as a kid because, and when I say a kid, I mean probably 8-9 years old, because they sang about hell's bells and being on the highway to hell, and the night prowler, he's coming to get you, and there's nothing you can do. And they linked it up to the Richard Ramirez Night Stalker case, Also, I think there was a kid by the name of Ricky Casso or Ricky Queso, and he had apparently killed someone. And both of these guys had, like, AC/DC memorabilia. And so AC/DC was this scary band, to me as a kid, and talked about hell and, dirty deeds and things of that nature. And I was terrified. But, my cousin later on, a different cousin, he introduced me to AC/DC's music. And finally, they sang about Hell's Bells and Highway to Hell and all that stuff, but I realized that they were just basically this band that they were almost cartoony, and it was fun to me to listen to their music because of the way they were. I kind of got out of it later on because they just basically made the same album over and over and over, but they got out of the fun stuff and got into just stiff upper lip and just stuff like that. But they were mega terrifying, when I was a kid with all that stuff. Night Prowler especially, God, that song terrified me because it was linked to that serial killer, which later on I got into reading about the serial killers and reading about all this stuff, but not as a kid. I was terrified. There were several songs. Shout at the Devil, Motley Crue. That song terrified me when it first came out, but about a year later I was like, eh. There was a song, I think, by Depeche Mode called Blasphemous Rumors that was just a pretty sick, sad song. And it scared me because when I grew up, or where I grew up and how I grew up, it was, blasphemy was just, the worst thing possible. And so, that song where he talks about he's gonna die and God's laughing at people dying and just weird stuff. And then Ecstasy come out with Dear God, the song that says don't believe in heaven or hell, saints and sinners and devil as well. And so just things like that terrified me as a kid because I grew up in a Christian home, and so it was just like, oh my gosh, these people are singing terrible things about God, and they're singing great things about Satan. So it was just like I said, these bands, they did not do anything to diffuse the situation of the Satanic Panic, so, but yeah, it's quite a topic, and we'll discuss the topic more later on. But those are some of the songs that kind of just gave me a fright as a kid. So if you like this video, press the like button and subscribe, and comment in the comment section. Tell me some songs that kind of gave you the creeps as a kid. Doesn't necessarily have to be related to the Satanic Panic, but just some scary songs in general. And thank you guys for watching.